Book 3. Chapter 1. Necessary Follies. But first I want to tell you, at least in synthesis, the follies I began to commit, trying to discover all those other Moscardas who lived in my closest neighbours in order to destroy them one by one. Necessary follies, because not having ever thought before of constructing from myself a Moscarda who in my eyes and for me would live in a way that would apparently signify me properly, personally, it was obviously impossible for me to act logically, coherently. Instance by instance, I had to portray myself as the opposite of what I was or supposed I was for this acquaintance or that, having made an effort to grasp the reality they had assigned me, feckless, of course, labile, inconsistent, and virtually insubstantial. But nevertheless, I must still have had a certain aspect, a certain meaning, a certain value for the others, not only in my features which lay outside my view and my estimation, but also many things I hadn't yet conceived. The moment I thought of this, I felt a sudden, fierce rebellion. Chapter 2. Discoveries. The name, so be it, ugly to the point of cruelty, Moscarda, like the fly Mosca, and the nuisance of its sharp buzzing irritation. My spirit surely didn't have a name of its own, or a birth certificate. It had a whole private world inside, and I didn't stamp that name of mine, to which I gave not the slightest thought, on all things I saw inside and around me. But for the others, I wasn't that world I carried inside me without a name, all of a piece, undivided and yet various. I was, on the contrary, outside, in their world, one, detached, who was called Moscarda. A small, determined aspect of reality not mine, included in the reality of others outside myself, and called Moscarda. I was talking with a friend, all quite ordinary. He answered me. I saw him gesticulating. He spoke in his usual voice. I recognized his usual gestures, and he too, listening to me as I spoke to him, recognized my voice and my gestures. Nothing out of the ordinary, no, but then I thought that the tone of my friend's voice had for me was nothing like the one he knew as his, because perhaps he didn't even know the tone of his voice, because, for him, his was that other voice, and his aspect was what I saw, the one I gave him, looking at him from outside, whereas he, as he spoke, surely didn't have in mind any image of himself, not even the one he gave himself and recognized in the mirror. Oh my God, what happened to me then? Was the same thing true of my voice, my appearance? I was no longer an undistinguished I who spoke and looked at the others, but rather one at whom the others looked outside of them, who had a tone of voice and an appearance I didn't recognize as me. For my friend, I was what he was for me, an impenetrable body that stood before him and that he privately conceived with features familiar to him, which for me meant nothing. I didn't even think of them as I spoke, nor could I see them or could I know what they were like, whereas for him they were everything. They represented me as I was for him, one among many, Moscarda. Was this possible? And Moscarda was all that it said and did in that world unknown to me. Moscarda was also my shadow. They saw Moscarda eating, they saw Moscarda smoking, Moscarda going for a stroll, Moscarda if he blew his nose. I didn't know it, I didn't think about it, but in my aspect, or rather in the one they gave me, in my every word spoken for them in a voice I couldn't know, in my every action interpreted by each in his own way, my name and my body were always implicit for the others. Except that here, no matter how stupid and hateful I might find it to be thus tagged forever, unable to give myself another name, or many others as I might choose, that suited on each occasion my shifting mood, my feelings, my actions, still, at this point, I repeat, accustomed as I was to bearing that one since birth, I could pay scant attention to it, and consider that, after all, I was not that name, and that name was for the others a way of calling me, not beautiful, but still it could have been even uglier. Wasn't there a Sardinian in Riccieri whose name was Porcu? Yes, Signor Porcu, and he certainly didn't answer with a grunt. At your service, sir? Very keen and polite and smiling, he answered, so courteously that you were almost ashamed of having called him by that name. So let's skip the name, and we'll also skip the features, although, now that in front of the mirror I clearly realized how I was necessarily unable to give myself an image different from the one with which I conceived myself, I felt also these features alien to my will, and spitefully contrary to any desire that might arise in me to have others different from these, that is, this hair of this colour, these eyes as they are, greenish, and this nose and this mouth. We'll skip also my features, as I said, because after all I had to accept the fact that they could even have been monstrous, and I would have had to keep them and resign myself to them if I wanted to live. But they weren't, and so all in all, I could even be satisfied with them. But my position, I mean the position that didn't arrive from me, the position that determined me, outside myself, outside any will of mine, My birth, the position of my family, I hadn't set it before me to judge it as the others might judge it. Each in his way, obviously, on his own special scales, the weight of envy, the weight of hatred, or of outrage, or whatever. I had till now believed myself a man in life, a man, period. Living as if in every respect I had made myself, but just as I had not made that body, as I had not given myself this name, and had been brought into life by others without my assent, so without my assent many things had befallen me, within, around me, coming from others. Many other things had been done to me, given me by others, that actually I had never thought of, had never given an image, the strange hostile image with which they struck me now. The story of my family in my town. I didn't think about it, but it was in me, this story, for the others. I was one, the last of this family, and I had in me, in my body, its imprint, and in countless habits of action and thought that I had never considered, though the others recognized them clearly in me, in my way of walking, laughing, greeting. I believed myself a man in life, an ordinary man who lived day by day a basically idle existence, however full of curious errant thoughts. No. I could be an ordinary man for myself, but not for the others. For the others I had many summary features, which I hadn't made or given to myself and to which I had never paid any attention. And my belief that I was an ordinary man, I mean, even my idleness, which I believed truly mine, was not mine for the others. It had been given me by my father. It derived from my father's wealth, and it was a fierce idleness because my father, what a discovery, my father, the life of my father. Chapter 3. The Roots. He appeared to me, tall, fat, bold, and in his clear, almost glassy pale blue eyes, the usual smile shone for me, with a strange tenderness, part sympathy, also part mockery, but affectionate, as if basically he liked my being one who deserved that mockery of his, as he considered me a kind of benevolent luxury he could safely allow himself. Except that this smile, in his thick beard, so red and so deeply rooted that his cheeks paled, this smile beneath the big moustache, yellowing a bit in the centre, was treacherous now, kind of dumb and frigid grin hidden there, to which I had never paid any attention, and that tenderness for me appearing, shining in his eyes from that hidden grin, now seemed to me horribly sly. It suddenly revealed to me so many things that made shudders ripple down my back. And there, the gaze of those glassy eyes held me fascinated, to prevent me from thinking of those things which were also part of his tenderness for me, though they were horrible. But you were and still are a silly, yes, a poor ingenuous scatterbrain, pursuing your thoughts, never stopping one of them in order to stop yourself. Never a notion comes to you that you don't start circling around it, and looking so long at it that in the end you fall asleep, and the next day you open your eyes and you see it in front of you and you no longer know how it could have come to you when yesterday there was this air and the sun. So you see I had necessarily to love you. My hands, what are you looking at? Are these red hairs here, also on the fingers, the rings, too many? And this big tie-pin, and also the gold watch chain. Too much gold? What are you looking at? Strangely, I saw my anguish distracted with some effort from those eyes, from all that gold, to suffer at some little bluish veins that were visibly winding up across his pale forehead, and with sorrow, at the shiny pate fringed with red hair, red like mine, or rather mine is like his, but is it mine, as it is so clearly came to me from him? And that shiny pate, little by little, faded before me as if engulfed by the empty air. My father! In the emptiness now, a terrified silence, heavy with all the senseless and shapeless things that lie inert, dumb, impenetrable for the spirit. It was an instant, but it was eternity. I felt inside all the horror of blind necessities, of things that cannot be changed, the prison of time, being born now, not before and not after, the name and the body that are given us, the chain of causes, the seed sown by that man, my father, without willing it, my coming into the world, from that seed, involuntary fruit of that man, bound to that branch, expressed from those roots. Chapter 4. The Seed. Then for the first time I saw my father as I had never seen him, outside, in his life, but not as he was for himself, not as he felt himself to be, that I couldn't know, but I saw him rather as a complete outsider to me, in the reality that I could assume the others gave him exactly as he now appeared to me. Perhaps it's the same with all sons, to observe as something obscene mortifying us where it is our father whom we respect. To observe, I mean, that the others don't give and can't give this father the same reality we give him. To discover how he lives and how he is a man outside, on his own, in his relations with the others, these others speaking with him or impelling him to speak, to laugh, to look, for a moment forget that we are present, and allow us to glimpse the man they know in him, the man he is for them. Another, what sort? There's no knowing. Promptly our father makes a sign, with his hand or with his eyes, reminding the other that we are also present, and that little furtive sign there, in an instant dug an abyss inside us. That father who was so close to us now has leaped far away and is glimpsed there as an outsider. And we feel as if our life has been totally torn apart, except for the one point where it remains still attached to that man, and this point is shameful. Our birth detached, severed from him, as an ordinary event, perhaps foreseen, but involuntary in the life of that outsider, proof of a gesture, fruit of an act, something in other words that now, yes, makes us ashamed, inspires outrage and almost hatred. Or if not downright hatred, a certain sharp irritation we notice also in our father's eyes, which at the moment have encountered ours. For him there, standing erect and with two alert, hostile eyes, we are what he did not expect from a momentary release or pleasure. For him there, standing erect and with two alert, hostile eyes, we are what he did not expect from a momentary release or pleasure, that cast seed of which he knew nothing, standing now erect and with a pair of protruding snails, eyes peering uncertainly and judging and preventing him from being again entirely as he chooses, free, another also for us. Chapter 5. Translation of a title. I had never before detached my father from me like this. I'd always thought of him, remembered him as father, what he was for me, not very much to tell the truth, because my mother died very young and I was sent to a boarding school far from Riccieri, and then to another, and then to a third, where I remained till the age of 18. And then I went to the university and I spent 6 years there, transferring from one department to another, deriving no practical benefit from any of them. For this reason I was finally recalled to Riccieri and immediately, as reward or punishment, I don't know, given a wife. 2 years later my father died, leaving me of himself, of his fondness, no memory more vivid than that smile of tenderness, which was, as I said before, part sympathy, part mockery. But what he had been for himself, he died now, that father, completely. What he had been for the others, and the little he had been for me, and the others surely, the reality the others gave him and he suspected, also inspired that smile for me. Now I understood it, and understood its motive, horribly. What is your father? Time and again my classmates had asked me at school, and I would answer banker, because my father for me was a banker. If your father were a hangman, how would they translate this title in your family to make it fit with your love for him and his for you? Oh, he is so good to you, yes. I know that. There's no need for you to tell me. I can imagine perfectly such a father's love for his son. The trembling delicacy of his big hands as he buttons the collar of the boy's white shirt. And then, how fierce, tomorrow at dawn, are those hands at the gallows. Because also a banker, as I can imagine perfectly, moves from 10% to 20, from 20 to 40, as in the town, gradually, with the other's loathing, the reputation of his usury also grows. And tomorrow it will weigh like a shame on his son, who for the present doesn't know and amuses himself with strange thoughts. Poor benevolent luxury, who truly deserved, let me tell you, that smile of tenderness, half sympathy, half mockery. Chapter 6. The Good Fierce Son. My eyes full of the horror of this discovery, but the horror veiled by a dejection, by a sadness that still made my lips form a hollow smile, in the suspicion that no one could believe and really allow those feelings in me. I then presented myself before my wife Dida. She was, I remember, in a luminous room, dressed in white, and all enfolded in a brilliant sunshine, arranging her new spring clothes in the great white and gilded 3-door wardrobe. Bitter with secret shame, making an effort to find in my throat a voice that wouldn't sound too strange, I asked her, "You know, Dida, what my profession is?" Holding a hanger with a filmy buff dress on it, Dida turned to look at me first, as if she didn't recognize me. Dazed, she repeated, "Your profession?" And I had to taste all over again the bitterness of that shame, as I repeated in a rending of my spirit the question derived from it. But this time it crumbled in my mouth. "Yes," I said, "what do I do?" Dida stood and looked at me for a moment, then burst into great laughter. "Why, what are you talking about, Gingy?" Suddenly, at the explosion of that laughter, my horror shattered. The nightmare of those blind necessities which my spirit had come upon a moment before, shuddering in the depths of its investigations. Ah yes, for the others, a usurer, her for my wife, Dida, a fool. Gingy was me, one in my spirit and one to the eyes of my wife, and no telling how many other Genjis were outside, in the spirit or only in the eyes of the people of Riccieri. It wasn't a question of my spirit, which felt free inside me, in its original privacy, immune to all those evaluations of things that had come to me, that had been made and given to me by the others, and chiefly this view of my father's money and his profession. No, Then what was it all about? If I could refuse to accept this despicable reality the others gave me, alas, I had still to accept the fact that if I, too, had given myself a reality on my own, this would not have been more true as reality than the one that others gave me, the one that for the others consisted of this body that now before my wife couldn't even seem to be mine, since it had been appropriated by her genje, who had just uttered another piece of nonsense which had made her laugh. To want to know his profession, didn't he know it already? Benevolent luxury, I said, as if to myself, separating the voice from a silence that seemed to me outside of life, because as a shadow before Dida, I no longer knew from where I, the real I, spoke to her. What are you saying? She repeated, from the solid certitude of her life, with that buff dress over her arm. And as I didn't answer, she came to me, took me by the arms, and blew on my eyes, as if to erase a gaze no longer Genje's, not of that Genje who, as she knew, had to pretend, like her, not to know how the townspeople translated the name of my father's profession. But wasn't I worse than my father? Wasn't I? My father at least worked, but I, what did I do? I played the good son fiercely, the good son who spoke of alien, even bizarre things, or the discovery of the nose that tilted to the right, or else of the other face of the moon, whereas my father's so-called bank, thanks to the efforts of the two trusted friends Furbo and Quantoso, went on working, prospering. There were minor partners in the bank, and also the two trusted friends had, as they say, an interest, and all went swimmingly without my intervention. I was loved by all those partners, by Quantoso like a son, by Furbo like a brother, and everyone knew that it was pointless to talk of business with me, and it sufficed every now and then to ask me to come in and sign something, and I signed, and that was all. Not all, because also every now and then someone would come and ask me to accompany him to Furbo or to Quantoso with a note of recommendation, yes, and I would then discover on his chin a dimple that divided it into two unequal parts, more prominent on one side and more receding on the other. Why hadn't they yet murdered me? They didn't murder me, gentlemen, because I hadn't yet detached myself to see myself, and I lived like a blind man in the position in which I had been put, without considering what it was, because in that position I had been born and had grown up, and it was therefore natural for me. So for the others, it was natural for me to be as I was. That was how they knew me. They couldn't conceive of me differently, and they all could look now at me almost without hatred, and could even smile at this fierce good son. Or, suddenly I felt jabbing into my soul two pairs of eyes, like four poisoned daggers, the eyes of Marco de Dio and of his wife Diamante, which I encountered every day on the streets as I came home. Chapter 5. A parenthesis necessary for all. Marco de Dio and his wife Diamante had the misfortune of being, if I remember rightly, my first victims. I mean the first designated for the experiment of the destruction of Mascada. But what gives me the right to talk about it? What right have I to give an aspect and a voice to others outside myself? What do I know of them? How can I talk about them? I see them from outside, and naturally as they are for me, that is to say, in a form in which they surely would not recognize themselves, and I am not doing to others the same wrong of which I complain, so? Yes, of course, but with one little difference. The fixations I mentioned at the beginning, that certain way in which each wants himself, constructing himself this way or that, according to how he sees himself and sincerely believes himself to be, not only for himself but also for the others, a presumption, in any case, for which the penalty must be paid. But you still refuse to give up, I know, and you exclaim, "What about the facts, for God's sake? Aren't there any facts?" Yes, there are. To be born is a fact, to be born in one period rather than another, as I've already said, and of this or that father, and in this or that condition, to be born male or female, in Lapland or in Central Africa, and handsome or ugly, with a hump or without, facts. And if you lose an eye, it's a fact, and you can even lose both, and if you're a painter, it's the worst fact that can happen to you. Time, space, necessity, fate, fortune, chance, or snares of life. You want to be, eh? There's this catch, in abstract you cannot just be. The being must be trapped in a form, and for some time it has to stay in it, here or there, this way or that. And everything, as long as it lasts, bears the penalty of its form, the penalty of being this way and of no longer being able to be otherwise. That freak there seems a jest, a joke that can be tolerated perhaps for a minute, and then no more. Then up he'll get, erect, quick, agile, tall, but no, he will always be like that for a whole life, and we only live once, and he has to resign himself to spending all of it like that. And as it is with forms, so it is with actions. When an act has been performed, it's that, it can no longer be changed. When a man, however, has acted, even if afterwards he doesn't feel or find himself in the actions performed, what he has done remains, like a prison for him. If you have taken a wife, or more materially, if you have stolen and been discovered, if you have killed, the consequences of your action enfold you like coils and tentacles, and on you, around you, like thick, stifling air, hangs the responsibility you have assumed for those actions and their consequences, unwanted, unforeseen, and how can you then free yourself? All right, but what do you mean by this? That acts, like forms, determine my reality or yours, and how? Why? They are a prison, no one can deny that. But if you want to assert only this, take care not to assert anything against me, because I say and affirm exactly that. They are a prison, and the most unjust prison imaginable. Good heavens, I thought I had proved this to you. I know X. According to my knowledge of him, I assign X a reality, for myself. But you also know X, and surely the one you know isn't the same one I know, because we know him in our way, and in our way we assign X a reality. Now also for himself X has as many realities as the people he knows, because he knows himself in one way with me, and in another with you, and another with a third, or a fourth, and so on, which means that X is really one for me, one for you, another for a third, another for a fourth, and so on, though he, more than anybody else, also has the illusion of being one for all. This is the problem, or the joke, if you prefer to call it that. We perform an act, we believe in good faith to be all in that act. We realize, unfortunately, that this is not so, and that the act, on the contrary, is always and only performed by the one of the many things we are or can be, and then, though a most unfortunate circumstance, we suddenly remain as if hooked and suspended. We realize, that we are not all in that act, and therefore it would be a horrible injustice to judge us from that alone, to keep us hooked and suspended from it, pilloried, for an entire existence, as if this were all summed up in that single act. But I am also this, and this other still, we start shouting. Many others, yes, so many who were not included in the act of that one, and who had nothing or very little to do with it. And besides, that oneself, that reality we gave ourselves in one moment and performed the act, often has totally vanished a moment later. So the memory of the act remains in us, if it does remain, as an anguished, inexplicable dream. Another 10 hours, all those others that we are or can be, rise one by one in us to ask how we could have done this, and we are no longer able to explain it. Past realities. If the facts are not so serious, these past realities we call undeceivings. Yes, agreed, because truly every reality is a deceit. That same deceit that now makes me say to you that you have another in front of you. You're mistaken. We are very superficial, you and I. We don't delve deeply into the joke, which is more profound and rooted, dear friends, and it consists in this. The human being acts necessarily through forms, the appearances he creates for himself, to which we give the value of reality, a value that changes naturally according to how the being appears to us in that form, in that act. And it must always necessarily seem to us that the others are mistaken, thinking that a given form, a given act is not this and is not thus. But inevitably, a little later, if we shift 1 degree, we realize we were also mistaken, and it isn't this and it isn't thus. So in the end we are obliged to recognize that it will never be this or thus in any stable, sure way, but first one way, then another, and at a certain point all will seem to us mistaken or all true, which amounts to the same thing, because a reality wasn't assigned to us and doesn't exist. We have to make it ourselves if we want to be, and it will never be one for all, one forever, but continuously and infinitely changeable. The capacity for deluding ourselves that today's reality is the only true one, on the one hand sustains us, but on the other it plunges us into an endless void, because today's reality is destined to prove delusion for us tomorrow, and life doesn't conclude, it can't conclude. Tomorrow if it concludes, it's finished. Chapter 8. We come down a bit. Does it seem to you we've aimed too high? Then we'll come down a bit. A ball is elastic, but in order to bounce it has to touch the ground. Let's touch the ground and have it return to our hand. What facts do you want to talk about? About the fact that I was born such and such a year, month, day, in the noble city of Riccieri, in the house on such and such a street, number so and so, son of Signor this and Signora that, baptized in the parish church, aged 6 days, sent to school aged 6 years, married aged 23, height 1 meter 68 centimeters, hair red, etc., etc. These are my vital statistics, facts you say, and from them you would like to extract my reality. But do you think these same data, which in themselves say nothing, can fix an evaluation which will be the same for all? And even if they depicted me completely and precisely, where would they depict me? In what reality? In yours, which is not another's, and then another's, and then another's, is there perhaps a sole reality, one for all? But we have seen there isn't one even for each of us, since our own inside us changes continuously. So, here we are, firmly on the ground. There are 5 of you? Come with me. This is the house in which I was born, such and such a year, a month, day. Well, from the fact that topographically, in its height and length and the number of windows here on the facade, this house is the same for all. From the fact that for all 5 of you I was born here, such and such a year, month, day, hair red, height 1 meter 68 centimeters, does it follow that all 5 of you give the same reality to this house and to me? To you who live in a hovel, this house seems a handsome building. To you who have a certain artistic taste, it seems very vulgar. And you who are reluctant to walk along the street where it stands because it reminds you of a sad event in your life, scowl at it. You, on the contrary, give it an affectionate look because, I know, just opposite lived your late mother, who was a good friend of my mother. And I, who was born here, good Lord, even if for all 5 of you in this house, which is 1 and 5, in such and such a year, on such and such a month, day, there was born a fool, do you think he would be the same fool for all of you? For one, I will be a fool because I leave Contorzo as manager of the bank and Furbo as its counsel. In short, for the very reason that another considers me extremely canny, though he thinks he sees my stupidity clearly in the fact that I take my wife's little dog out for a walk every day, and so on. 5 fools, 1 in each. 5 fools who stand before you as you see them from outside. In me, who am 1 and 5 like the house, all with its name of Moscada, nothing in itself, not even one. If it serves to identify 5 different fools who, yes, will turn around, all 5 if you call out Moscada, but each with that aspect you give him, 5 aspects. If I laugh, 5 smiles, and so on. And for you, won't every act I perform be the act of one of those 5? And can it be the same, this act, if the 5 are different? Each of you will interpret it, will give it meaning and value according to the reality you have given me. One will say, Moscada did this. The other will say, this indeed, he did something quite different. And the third, if you ask me, he did the right thing. He had to do this. The fourth, right, my foot, he did quite the wrong thing. He should have done instead. And the fifth, what should he have done? Why, he hasn't done anything. And you will be capable of fighting over what Moscada did and didn't do, over what he should have or shouldn't have done, refusing to understand that the Moscada of one is not the Moscada of the other, thinking to speak about only one Moscada, really one, yes, the one who stands before you thus, and so, as you see him, as you touch him, you speak actually of 5 Moscadas, because the other 4 of you have one before them, one each, that one alone, thus and so, as each sees and touches him, 5 or 6 if poor Moscada sees and touches one also for himself, 1 and no one, alas, as he sees and touches himself, if the other 5 see him and touch him differently. Chapter 9. We end the parenthesis. All the same, I will make an effort, have no doubt, to give you that reality you think you have, in other words, to want you and me as you want yourselves. It's not possible, as we now know, well, since, no matter how great an effort I make to depict you, in your way, it will always be a your way, only for me, not a your way for you and for the others. But excuse me, if for you I have no other reality beyond the one you give me, and I am ready to accept, admit that it is no less true than the one I might give myself. Indeed, for you it is the only true one, and God only knows what this reality is that you give me. Would you want to complain now of the one I will give you, with the best of intentions to depict you as far as I can in your way? I don't presume to claim you are the way I depict you. I've already asserted you're not even that one you depict for yourself, but many together, according to all your possibilities of being and events, relations, circumstances. So what wrong am I doing you? You are wronging me, thinking I don't have or can't have any reality beyond this one you assign me, which is yours alone. Believe me, an idea of yours, the idea you formed of me, possibility of being as you feel it, as it seems to you, as you recognize it possible in you, for of what I can be for myself, not only can you know nothing, but I myself can know nothing. Chapter 10. 2 visitors. And I am pleased that just now, as you are reading this little book of mine, with a somewhat mocking smile that has accompanied your reading from the start, 2 visits, one inside the other, occurred suddenly to show you how foolish that smile of yours was. You are still disconcerted, I can see, irritated, mortified by the poor showing you made with your old friend, dismissed shortly after the arrival of the newcomer on a shabby pretext, because you could no longer bear to see him, to hear him talk and laugh in the presence of the other. What? Dismiss him like that, when until that other arrived you so enjoyed talking and laughing with him? Dismissed? Who? Your friend? Do you seriously believe you dismissed him? Reflect a bit. Your old friend, in himself and for himself, had no reason to be sent away on the arrival of the new one. The two didn't know each other at all. You introduced them one to the other, and they could have stayed together a half hour in your living room to chat about this and that. No embarrassment for the one or for the other. You are the one who felt embarrassment, and all the more vivid and unbearable indeed, the more you saw those two gradually adjusting to each other and finding an accord. You promptly broke it, that accord. Why? Why, because you still refused to understand. You suddenly, at the arrival of your new friend, discovered yourself as two, one so different from the other, that at a certain point, unable to stand it any longer, you had to send one away. You dismissed not your old friend, no, you got rid of yourself, the one you are for your old friend, because you felt him quite different from what you are or want to be for the new friend. It wasn't those two who were incompatible, those strangers one to the other, both very polite and perhaps made to get along splendidly. It was the two yous that you suddenly discovered in yourself. You are unable to allow the affairs of the one to be mixed with those of the other, since they actually had nothing in common. Nothing. As for your old friend, you have one reality and another for the new one, and the two are so different in everything that you yourself saw how, when you addressed the one, the other would look at you, dumbfounded. He couldn't recognize you anymore. He would exclaim to himself, "What? Is this he? Is he like this?" Book 4. Chapter 1. What Marco di Dio and his wife Diamante were for me. I say were, but perhaps they are still alive. Where? Here still, perhaps, and I might see them tomorrow. But here, where? I no longer have a world for myself. I can learn nothing of them, of where they are presumed to be. I know for sure that they walk along the street. Tomorrow I could run into them in the street. I could ask him, "Are you Marco di Dio?" And he would answer me, "Yes, Marco di Dio." "And you walk along this street?" "Yes, along this street." "And this is your wife Diamante?" "Yes, my wife Diamante." "And this street is called thus and so?" "Thus and so, it has so many houses, so many cross streets, so many lamps, etc., etc." Like an Ollendorff grammar. Well, this was enough for me then, as it is for you now, to establish the reality of Marco di Dio and of his wife Diamante, and of the street where I could still run into them, as I ran into them then. When? Oh, not many years ago. What splendid precision of space and time. That street 5 years ago. Eternity collapsed for me, not over these 5 years, but all in 1 minute. And the world in which I lived then seems to me more distant than the most distant star in the sky. Marco di Dio and his wife Diamante seemed to me two wretches, but while on one hand poverty had apparently convinced them it was unnecessary now to wash their faces every morning, surely on the other hand it had convinced them to leave no stone unturned, not so much in an effort to scrape up the daily pittance that would at least keep them from starving, but rather to become overnight millionaires, as he would say, in syllables, his grim eyes wide. I laughed, and everybody else laughed with me, hearing him say it like that. Now I feel horror when I consider that I could laugh then only because I hadn't yet come to doubt that corroborating, most providential phenomenon called the regularity of experiences, so I could consider a comical dream the idea that anyone could become a millionaire overnight. But what if this, which has already been proved a very fine thread, I mean the regularity of experiences, had snapped inside me? What if by repetition 2 or 3 times this comical dream had instead acquired regularity for me? For me, too, it would have proved impossible to doubt that one can really become a millionaire overnight. Those who live within the blissful regularity of experiences cannot imagine what things might be real or likely for those who live outside every rule, as in fact that man did. He believed himself an inventor. And an inventor, gentlemen, one fine day opens his eyes, invents a thing, and lo, he becomes a millionaire. Many still remember him as a savage, just arrived in Riccieri from the country. They remember that he was then taken into the studio of one of our most respected artists, now dead, and that in a short time he had learned how to carve marble expertly. But then the master one day decided to use him as a model for a group of his that, exhibited in a plaster-cast version, became famous under the title Satire and Youth. The artist had been able to translate into clay intact a fantastic vision, not chaste, to be sure, but very beautiful, and he could be content with it and enjoy the praise it got. The crime was in the clay. The master never suspected that his disciple might feel the temptation to translate that fantastic vision for himself from the clay, where it had been admirably fixed forever, into a momentary and no longer praiseworthy act, while, oppressed by the sultriness of a summer afternoon, he was sweating in the studio, blocking out that group in marble. The real youth refused to assume the smiling docility that the false one displayed in the clay. He cried for help, people came running. Marco de Dio was surprised in an act that belonged to the animal suddenly roused in him in that moment of sultriness. Now let's be fair, animal, yes, revolting in that act, but in so many other acts honestly documented. Wasn't Marco de Dio perhaps also the fine young man his master declared he had always known his assistant to be? I realize I am offending your morality with this question. In fact, your answer is that if such a temptation could arise in Marco de Dio, then obviously he wasn't the fine young man his master said. I could point out to you, however, that similar temptations, and even more evil ones, abound in the lives of the saints. The saints attributed them to the works of the devil, and with God's help were able to overcome them. Similarly, the restraints you habitually impose on yourselves as a rule prevent those temptations from stirring in you, or the unexpected release of the thief or the murderer in you. The oppression of a sultry summer afternoon has never succeeded in melting the crust of your habitual probity, momentarily rousing you in the original animal you can condemn. But what if I were to start talking to you about Julius Caesar, whose imperial glory fills you with such admiration? Vulgarity, you explain. He was no longer then Julius Caesar. We admire him when Julius Caesar was truly himself. Very well, himself. But you see, if Julius Caesar was himself only at the times when you admire him, when he wasn't there anymore, where was he? Who was he? No one? Anyone? Who? You must ask his wife, Calpurnia, or Nicomedes, king of Bithynia. Little by little, you have got this into your head. Julius Caesar, as one man, didn't exist. There existed, yes, one Julius Caesar as, for so much of his life, he portrayed himself, and this one had no doubt a value much greater than the others, not, however, as far as reality is concerned. I beg you to believe me, because just as the imperial Julius Caesar was real, so was that mincing, irritating one, all shaven and ingirt and very unfaithful to his wife Calpurnia, or that shameless Caesar of Nicomedes, king of Bithynia. This is the trouble always, gentlemen. All of them had to be called by that one name, Julius Caesar, and in one body of the male sex, so many of them, including even a female, had to live together, and wanting to be female, not finding the way in that male body when the opportunity presented itself, she was female unnaturally, shamelessly repeating this behaviour on several occasions. The satire in that poor Marco de Dio got out, actually only once, when tempted by the group made by his master. Caught in that act of a moment, he was condemned forever. He found no one who would respect him, and, on coming out of prison, he started devising the most cockeyed plans to pull himself out of the ignominious poverty into which he had fallen, arm in arm with a woman who one fine day had come to him no one knew how or whence. For about 10 years he had been saying he was leaving for England the next week, but had these 10 years perhaps passed for him? They had passed for those who heard his talk. He was always determined to leave for England next week, and he studied English, or at least for years he had kept under his arm an English grammar, open always at the same place, so those 2 open pages, rubbing against his arm with the filth of his jacket, had now become illegible, whereas the following pages were incredibly clean. But he knew the context up to the soiled part, and from time to time, walking along the street, he would frown, taking his wife by surprise, ask her some question, as if to test her promptitude and progress. Is Jane a happy child? And his wife would reply, prompt and serious, yes, Jane is a happy child, because his wife too would be leaving for England next week with him. It was alarming and at the same time pathetic, the sight of this woman, and the way he had been able to attract her, and make her live like a faithful dog in that comical dream of his, of becoming a millionaire overnight with an invention, for example, of odorless latrines for towns without running water in the houses. You laugh? Their seriousness was so ghastly for this reason, because everybody laughed at it. Indeed, it was fierce, and it became more and more fierce as around them there was more and more laughter. And by now they had come to such a pass that if anyone happened to stop and listen to their plans without laughing at them, instead of being pleased, they would give him withering sidelong glances, not just of suspicion, but also of hatred, because the mockery of the others was by now the air their dream breathed. If the mockery was removed, they risked suffocation. And so I understood why, for them, their worst enemy was my father. I, in fact, was not the only one with whom my father allowed himself that luxury of being benevolent that I mentioned earlier. He was content also to ease with an unflagging munificence, and laughing with that special smile of his, the obtuse illusions of certain people who, like Marco di Dio, came to him to bewail their unhappiness at not having what was needed to achieve their plans, their dream, wealth. How much, my father would ask? Oh, very little, because a very little was always enough to make them become rich, millionaires, and my father would give it. What, you said it would take so little? I know, I hadn't calculated properly, but now, really, how much? Oh, very little. And my father kept on giving, but then at a certain point he had enough, and then, as you can easily understand, they didn't remain grateful to him for not having wanted to go on enjoying and mocking their total disappointment to the very end. So they were then able to attribute to him without remorse the failure of their delusions, just at the crucial moment, and no one more insistently than they took their revenge by calling my father usurer. The most insistent of all had been this Marco di Dio, who now, after my father's death, poured out on me, and not without reason, his fierce hatred. Not without reason, because I, too, almost unbeknownst to myself, went on benefiting him. I let him stay on in a hovel that belonged to me, and neither Furbo nor Quantorso had ever asked him to pay rent. Now this same hovel gave me the opportunity to use him for my first experiment. Chapter 2. But it was total. Total, because it was enough to stir in me only slightly, as if for a joke, the will to portray myself differently from one of the 100,000 in which I lived, and in 100,000 different ways all my other realities were altered. And perforce this joke, if you think it over, had to earn me madness, or rather this horror, the awareness of madness, fresh and clear, gentlemen, fresh and clear as an April morning, and shiny and precise as a mirror. Because I was walking along towards that first experiment, I was going to set my will outside myself, charmingly, like a handkerchief I took from my pocket. I wanted to perform an act that was to belong not to me, but to that shadow of me that lived its reality in another, a reality so solid and true that I could have doffed my hat and greeted it, if through damned necessity I hadn't had to encounter and greet it, not exactly in myself, but in my same body, which being of itself no one, could be mine, and was mine in so far as it portrayed me to myself, but it could also be and was that shadows, those 100,000 shadows, who portrayed me in 100,000 ways, alive and different to 100,000 others. In fact, wasn't I perhaps going towards Signor Vitangelo Moscarda to play a nasty trick on him? Ah, gentlemen, yes, a nasty trick. Excuse me all these coy winks, but I need to wink like this, because as I can have no idea how I appear to you at this moment, I try with these hints to guess, to make him perform an act totally unlike himself and incoherent, an act that, abruptly destroying the logic of his reality, will thus annihilate him in the eyes of Marco di Dio as in the eyes of so many others, without understanding full that the consequence of such an act couldn't be the one I imagined. I envisioned presenting myself afterwards to everyone and asking, "You see now, gentlemen, it's not in the least true that I'm the usurer you want to see in me." Instead, there was this other consequence. All exclaimed aghast, "Well, have you heard? The usurer Moscarda has gone crazy." Because the usurer Moscarda could of course go crazy, but he couldn't be destroyed abruptly by an act contrary to himself and incoherent. He wasn't a shadow to be joked with and underestimated, not the usurer Moscarda. He was a gentleman to be treated with due respect. Height, 1 meter 68 centimeters, hair red like his papa's, founder of the bank, with eyebrows true, like circumflex accents, and that nose that tilted to the right, like the nose of that dear, stupid Genge of my wife Dida, a gentleman, in other words, who, God forbid in going crazy, risked dragging with himself to the asylum all the Moscardas that I was for the others even, God help us, that poor harmless Genge of my wife Dida, and if I may say so, also me who, light-hearted and smiling, had joked with him. I risked, that is, we all risked, as you will see, the insane asylum, this first time, and that wasn't enough for us. We also had to risk our life, so that I could recover and find at the end, one, no one, and 100,000, the way of health. But we mustn't get ahead of ourselves. Chapter 3. The Notary's Document. I went first to the office of the notary stamper at Via del Crocifisso, number 24, because, these are absolutely certain facts, on the day of the year, under the reign of Victor Emmanuel III, by the grace of God and the nation's will King of Italy, in the noble city of Riccieri, in Via del Crocifisso, number 24, there was the office of the royal notary, Signor Stampa, Cavaliere, Elpidio Stampa, aged 52 or 53. Is he still there, at number 24? Do you all know the notary stamper? Ah, then we can be sure we'll make no mistakes. That notary stamper, the one we all know. Got that? But on entering the office, I was in a condition you cannot imagine. How can you imagine it, excuse me, if it still seems to you that the most natural thing in the world to enter a notary's office, to draft some document or other, and if you all say you know this notary stamper? I tell you I was going there on that day for my first experiment. And now really, do you want to make this experiment with me, yes or no, once and for all? I mean to penetrate the frightful joke lying beneath peaceful naturalness of everyday relations, the things that seem the most usual and normal, and also beneath the calm appearance of so-called reality. The joke, good God, thanks to which you may become angry every 5 minutes and shout at the friend with you, "Really, can't you see this? Are you blind?" And the other man doesn't see it, no, because he sees something else. When you believe he should see everything as it appears to you, he sees it on the contrary as it appears to him, and for him, therefore, you're the one who's blind. This is the joke, I mean, and I had already penetrated it. Now I was entering that office, burdened with all the reflections and considerations I had been brooding over so long, and I felt them seething inside me in great turmoil, and I wanted, meanwhile, to remain like this, in a lucid fixity, an almost immobile frigidity, while, as you can imagine, suppressing the loud laughter I felt like releasing as I saw before me, very grave, that poor notary, poor Signor Stampa, who hadn't the slightest suspicion that, for myself, I might not be as he saw me. He was surely convinced that he was for me the same person that he saw for himself every day, as he tied his little black cravat before the mirror with all his things around him. Do you understand now? I felt like winking at him too, slyly hinting to him, "Watch out, watch out." But I also felt, my God, like suddenly sticking out my tongue, or like wiggling my nose with a sudden twitch, to alter all at once, in fun and without malice, that image of me he believed true. But I had to be serious. Eh? Yes, serious. I had to carry out the experiment. Now then, notary, here I am. But excuse me, are you always immersed in this silence? He turned abruptly to look me up and down. He said, "Silence? What silence?" Along Via del Crocifisso, in fact, at that moment there was a steady traffic of people and vehicles. No, not in the street, of course, but there are all these papers here, sir, behind the dusty glass of these bookshelves. Can't you hear? Half distressed, half dazed, he studied me once more, then he pricked up his ears. What should I hear? Why, this scratching. Are the little feet, forgive me, the little feet of your canary. Do forgive me. Those little feet have claws, and they're scratching on the zinc of the cage. Yes, true, but what do you mean? Oh, nothing. Doesn't it get on your nerves, that zinc, Signor Stampa? Zinc? Why, who notices it? I don't. All the same, that zinc, imagine, in a cage, under the delicate claws of a canary, in the office of a notary. I'll bet he doesn't sing, this canary. No, he certainly does not. The notary was beginning to look at me in a certain way, and I considered it wise to skip the canary rather than endanger the experiment, which, at least in the beginning, and particularly here, in the presence of the notary, required that there should be no cause for doubt concerning my mental faculties. And I asked the notary if he knew of a certain house located in such and such a street, belonging to one Signor Vitangelo Moscarda, son of the late Francesco Antonio Moscarda. Isn't that you? Yes, it's me. It should be me. It was so beautiful, and what a pity, in that notary's office, among all those yellowing files, on those dusty old shelves, to talk like this, as if at a distance of centuries, about a certain house belonging to one Vitangelo Moscarda. All the more as I was, indeed, there, present and party to the document, in that notary's office. But who knows how and where the notary saw it, that office of his, what odour he smelled, different from the one I was smelling, and who knows how and where, in the notary's world, stood that certain house of which I spoke to him in a distant voice, and I, my place in the world of the notary, who knows how curious it was. Ah, the pleasure of history, gentlemen. Nothing is more restful than history. In life everything changes continually before your eyes. Nothing is certain, and there's this unremitting anxiousness to know how situations will come out, to see the conclusion of events that keep you in such torment and such agitation. Everything is determined, established precisely in history. However painful the events, however sad the situations, that they are, in order at least, fixed in 30, 40 little pages of a book. Those there. They will never change again, at least until some wicked critical spirit comes to take spiteful pleasure in upsetting that ideal construction, where all the elements were fitted together so well, and you could repose there and admire the way each effect obediently followed its course with perfect logic, and each event unfolded precise and coherent in its every detail, with Monsieur le Duc de Nevers, who on this day in this year, etc., etc. But to avoid spoiling everything, I had to force myself to return to the suspended, temporary, and consternated reality of the notary stamper. "Ah, yes," I hastened to say to him, "that's me, sir. And the house you have no difficulty, do you, in agreeing that it's mine, as is the whole inheritance of the late Francesco Antonio Moscardo, my father? Of course, actually that house, Signor Stamper, is not rented at present. Oh, it's small, you realize, perhaps 5 or 6 rooms, with 2 basements. Is that the right term? Yes, basements. Unrented, then, notary, and I can dispose of it as I choose. Now then, you—" And here I bent over and in a low voice, with great seriousness, confided in the notary the act I wanted him to draw up. "Here for the moment, I can't describe it because," I said to him, "it must remain between me and you, notary, under the seal of professional secrecy as long as I deem right. Are we agreed?" "Agreed. But the notary warned me that to draw up that act, he needed some data and other documents, which made it necessary for me to go to the bank, to Quantorzo. I was vexed, but I stood up. As I moved, I felt an accursed desire to ask the notary, 'How do I walk? Excuse me, can you tell me at least how you see me walk?' I barely restrained myself, but I couldn't keep from turning, as I opened the glass door to say to him, with a smile of compassion, 'Yes, at my own pace, thank you.' 'What did you say?' the notary asked, dazed. 'Ah, nothing. I just said I was going off at my own pace, notary. But do you know, I once saw a horse laugh. Yes, sir, as the horse was walking along. You go now and look at a horse's face to see it laugh, and then come and tell me you didn't see it laugh. Ah, but did I say the face? Horses don't laugh with their face after all. You know what horses laugh with, sir? With their rump. I assure you that a horse, as he walks along, laughs with his rump. Yes, sometimes at certain things he sees or that come into his head. If you want to see a horse laugh, look at his rump and you'll enjoy yourself.' I understand it was a mistake to tell him this. I understand everything. But if I return to the condition of spirit I was in then, when seeing people's eyes on me, I felt as if I were being subjected to a horrible oppression, thinking that all those eyes gave me an image that surely wasn't the one I knew myself, but another that I could neither know nor prevent. Merely saying mad things was nothing. I felt like doing them, doing mad things, rolling over in the streets or flying along in dance steps, winking here, sticking out my tongue, making faces there, and instead I walked down the street, serious, so serious, and now you too, marvellous, walking along so serious. Chapter 4. The High Road. So then I had to go to the bank for those papers the notary needed concerning the house. They were mine, those papers, no doubt about that, because the house was mine and I could dispose of it. But when you think about it, although those papers were mine, I could possess them only by theft or by wresting them with mad violence from the hands of another, who in everyone's eyes was their legitimate owner. I mean Signor Vitangelo Moscardo, the usurer. For me this was obvious, because I saw him clearly from outside, alive in others and not in me, that usurer Signor Vitangelo Moscardo. But for the others, who on the contrary saw no one in me except that usurer, for the others, I, there at the bank, was going to steal those papers from myself, or madly wrest them from my own hands. I couldn't say I wasn't me, could I, or that I was someone else, nor could I rationalize in any way possible an act meant really to seem in everyone's eyes contrary to myself and incoherent. Perfectly aware, as you see, I continued walking along the high road of madness, which was in fact the road of my reality, as it now very clearly opened before me, with all the images of me alive, mirrored, proceeding with me. But I was crazy because I had in fact this precise and mirroring awareness, you who also walk along the same street, without choosing to be aware of it. You are sane, and the more sane you are, the louder you shout at the one walking beside you. I, this, I, thus, you're blind, you're crazy. Chapter 5. Oppression. Theft, in any case, wasn't possible, at least not there and then. I didn't know where those papers were. The lowest subaltern of Quantorzo or of Furbo was more master in that bank than I. Whenever I entered, having been asked to come and sign something, the clerks didn't even raise their eyes from their ledgers, and if someone did look at me, his gaze demonstrated most clearly that he held me in absolutely no consideration. And yet there they all worked so zealously for me, to reassert more and more through their assiduous efforts the unfortunate concept that the town had of me. I was a usurer, and it never occurred to anyone that instead of being grateful for their zeal and ready to praise them for it, I might actually feel offended. Ah, how stiff and bored and dramped that bank was, All those glass partitions that ran along the 3 big rooms in a row, partitions of frosted glass, with 5 windows in each, yellow, as the cornice was yellow and the frame of the broad panels was yellow, and there were ink stains here and there some strips of paper glued over a crack in the glass, and the pavement of old terracotta tiles was worn in the centre, along the line of the 3 rooms, worn also in front of each window, sad corridor, with those panels of the partitions on one side, and the panes of the 2 broad, dusty windows on the other, in each room, and those rows of numbers on the walls, in pen, in pencil, over the little ink-stained tables between one window and the next, under the peeling frames of some smoky old canvases, here and there swollen and dusty, hanging there, and a smell of age everywhere, mixed with a sharp smell of the paper of the ledgers and the odours from a bakery below on the ground floor, and the desperate melancholy of those few old-fashioned chairs, near the tables where no one sat, which everyone pulled aside and left there, out of place for those poor useless chairs. It was surely an insult and a torment to be abandoned in that way. Time and again, on entering, I had wanted to remark, "But what's the point of these chairs? Why are they sentenced to stay here when nobody uses them?" I had checked myself, not because I sensed just in time that in such a place any pity for the chairs would have dumbfounded everybody, and I would have even risked seeming cynical. I checked myself, sensing, on the contrary, that I would have made others laugh at me for my concern about something that would have surely seemed eccentric to anyone who knew what little concern I had for business. That day, on entering, I found the clerks crowded into the last room, splitting their sides with laughter as they witnessed an argument between Stefano Furbo and a man named Tirola, taunted by everybody because of the way he dressed, among other things. A long jacket, that poor Tirola said, on him, short as he was, would have made him seem still shorter, and he was right. But stocky and grave, with his sergeant's moustache, he didn't realise, meanwhile, how ridiculous his shortened jacket looked on him bearing his solid buttocks. Now on the verge of tears, downcast, flushed, frustrated by the laughter of his fellows, he raised one little arm and declared to Furbo, "My God, how you twist a man's words!" Furbo was upon him, shouting in his face, shaking him furiously by that upraised arm. "Why, what do you know? What do you know? You don't even know the letter O, and yet it looks like you." I learned this was all about someone who had applied for a loan from the bank. Tirola had introduced him, saying he knew the person to be a good man, whereas Furbo insisted the opposite. I was seized by an impulse of rebellion. Unaware of the secret torture of my spirit, no one could understand the reason, and all were aghast when, pulling away 2 or 3 of those clerks, I shouted at Furbo, "And what about you? What do you know? What entitles you to place yourself above someone else like this?" Amazed, Furbo turned to look at me, and as if unable to believe he was seeing me assailing him like this, he shouted, "Are you crazy?" I was inspired, I don't know how, to fling in his face an offensive answer which horrified everyone. "Yes, like your wife, it suits you to keep her shut up in an asylum." He stood failing me, pale and distraught. "What did you say? What suits me?" I shrugged, annoyed by the dismay that had overcome everyone, and at the same time, within myself, as if suddenly deafened by the awareness of how inopportune my remark was, I answered softly to cut it short, "Oh yes, you know." And, as if after those words I had suddenly become who knows what stone, I could hear something Furbo yelled at me through clenched teeth before he rushed out in a fury. I know I was smiling as Quantorzo, arriving on the scene of the argument, dragged me away into the little office of the management. I was smiling to prove there was no further need of that violence, and everything was over, though at that moment, even as I smiled, I felt clearly that I could have killed someone. I was so vexed by Quantorzo's agitated sternness. In the little office, I began looking around, stunned myself that the strange daze into which I had so abruptly fallen didn't prevent me from perceiving things distinctly and clearly, so clearly that I was almost tempted to laugh at them. At Quantorzo's fierce reproach, I deliberately responded with some childish, curious questions about this or that object of the room, and meanwhile, I don't know how, almost automatically, I thought how when Stefano Furbo was little, they had put buttons along his back, and though you couldn't see his hump, the whole shape of his body was a humpback's, yes, on those long bird's legs, frail but elegant, ah yes, a fake elegant humpback, well made. And as I was thinking in this way, it was suddenly clear why he should exploit his uncommon intelligence to avenge himself on all those who, when little, had not had, like him, buttons down their back. I thought these things, I repeat, as if they were being thought by another inside me, the one who had suddenly become strange, cold, and absent. The coldness was meant not so much to set up a defence, if required, but rather to portray a part, behind which it was best for me to keep still hidden what had been made clear to me of the frightful truth, which I was discovering more and more. Why, yes, it's all here, I thought. In this oppression, each wants to impose on the others that world he has inside himself, as if it were outside, to make all see it his way, and the other cannot be in it except as he sees them. Before my eyes, the stupid faces of all those clerks returned, and I went on thinking, why yes, what sort of reality can the majority of men establish? I thought these things, I repeat, as if they were being thought by another inside me, the one who had suddenly become strange, cold, and absent. That coldness was meant not so much to set up a defence if required, but rather to portray a part, behind which it was best for me to keep still hidden what had been made clear to me of the frightful truth, which I was discovering more and more. Why, yes, it's all here, I thought. In this oppression, each wants to impose on the others that world he has inside himself, as if it were outside, to make all see it his way, and the others cannot be in it except as he sees them. Before my eyes, the stupid faces of all those clerks returned, and I went on thinking, why yes, what sort of reality can the majority of men manage to establish in themselves? Wretched, unsteady, uncertain, and oppressors of course take advantage, or rather they deceive themselves that they can take advantage, making others undergo or accept the meaning and value they assign to themselves, to the others, to things, so all will see and feel, think and speak in their way. I rose from my chair. I went to the window, greatly refreshed. Then I turned towards Quantorzo, who, interrupted at the climax of his speech, was looking at me with wide eyes. Pursuing the thought that was torturing me, I said, No, they deceive themselves. Who deceives himself? Those who want to oppress. Signor Furbo, for example. They deceive themselves because truly, my dear sir, they can impose nothing but words. Words, you understand, words that each understands and repeats in his own way. Ah, but this, too, is how so-called current opinions are formed, and woe to anybody who one day finds himself branded by one of these words they all repeat. For example, usurer, or for example, madman. Answer me this, now. How can you remain calm, thinking that there is someone who makes a great effort to persuade the others that you are as he sees you? How can you let him establish yourself in others' opinion according to his judgment of you, preventing the others from seeing you and judging you differently? I barely had time to notice Quantorzo's amazement. Then I saw Stefano Furbo before me. In his eyes I immediately perceived that in those few instants he had become my enemy. So I was immediately also an enemy. Enemy because he didn't understand that, while my words may have been hard, the sentiment that a little earlier had inspired me wasn't directed against him. And in fact I was prepared to apologize to him for those words. Indeed, as if drunk, I did more. When he confronted me, grim and menacing, and said, "You'll answer to me for what you said about my wife," I knelt down. "Of course, look," I cried, "like this," and I touched the floor with my forehead. I was immediately horrified by my act, or rather by the thought that he and Quantorzo might think I had knelt down for his sake. I looked at them laughing, and plunk on the floor again twice with my forehead. You, not I, you understand. At your wife's feet, you understand. You, not I, should kneel like this, and I, and he, and all of us, at the feet of the so-called mad, like this. I sprang up again, seething. The two looked into each other's eyes with fright. One asked the other, "What is he saying?" "New words," I cried. "You want to hear them? Go there, to where you keep them locked up. Go and hear them talk. You keep them locked up because it's in your interest." I grabbed Furbo by the lapel of his jacket and shook him, laughing. "You understand, Stefano. I don't have it in only for you. You've taken offence. No, my dear friend. What did your wife say of you? That you're a rake, a thief, a counterfeiter, an impostor, that you do nothing but tell lies? It's not true. Nobody can believe it. But before you locked her up, eh? We all listened to her and we were frightened. I'd like to know why." Furbo barely glanced at me, turned to Quantorzo to ask his advice with foolish pain, and said, "That's a good one. Why? Because, of course, nobody could believe her." "Ah, no, dear friend," I shouted at him. "Look me straight in the eye." "What do you mean?" "Look me in the eye," I repeated. "I'm not saying it's true, don't worry." He forced himself to look at me, paling. "You see," I shouted at him then. "You see? You yourself. You too have fear in your eyes now." "Because you seem mad to me," he shouted in my face, exasperated. I burst out laughing, and I laughed for a long time, unable to stop myself, noticing the fear, the confusion they both felt at this laughter of mine. I stopped all of a sudden, frightened myself by their eyes as they looked at me. What I had done, what I was saying surely had neither rhyme nor reason for them. To recover myself, I said curtly, "In short, I came here today to ask you about a certain Marco de Dio. I would like to know how it is that for years this man has paid no rent and no eviction notice has yet been served on him." I wasn't expecting to see them struck by such great amazement at this question. They looked at each other as if to find each in the sight of the other some support that would alleviate the dismay I was causing them, I, or rather an unknown being whom they were discovering in me all of a sudden. "What are you saying? What are you talking about?" Quantorzo asked. "You hear me? Marco de Dio. Does he pay rent, or doesn't he?" They continued looking at each other agape. Again, I burst out laughing. Then all at once I became serious and said, as if to someone else standing before me, someone who had suddenly sprung up in front of them, "Since when have you concerned yourself with these matters?" More amazed than ever, as if terrified, they shifted their eyes to seek in me the person who had uttered the very words they had thought and had been about to say to me. What, I'd said them myself? "Yes," I went on gravely, in the same vein. "You know very well your father let him stay there for many years without disturbing him, this Marco de Dio. What's made you suddenly think of him now?" I put my hand on Quantorzo's shoulder, and with an air no less grave, but now charged with an anguished wariness, I added, "I warn you, my friend, that I am not my father." Then I turned to Furbo, and putting my other hand on his shoulder, I said, "I want you to prepare the documents at once. Immediate eviction. I'm the master here, and I give the orders. I then want the list of my houses with a file on each one. Where are they?" Clear words, precise questions. Marco de Dio, eviction, list of houses, files. Well, the two of them didn't understand me. They looked at me like a pair of lunatics, and I had to repeat several times what I wanted and make them show me to the case where the file was found on that house that the notary stamper required. When I was in the little room where the case stood, I took by the arm Furbo and Quantorzo, who had led me there like two robots, and I put them out, shutting the door behind them. I'm sure they remained quite a while outside that door, looking into each other's eyes, stupefied, and then one said to the other, "He must have gone crazy." Chapter 6. The Theft. That case, the moment I was alone, gripped me at once, like a nightmare, as if it were actually alive, independent. I felt its encumbering presence, ancient and inviolate custodian of all the files with which it was gravid, old as it was, heavy and worm-eaten. I looked at it, and immediately I looked around, my eyes down. The window, an old rush-bottom chair, a still older little table, bare, black, and covered with dust. There was nothing else in the room. And the light filtered drearily, though the panes so smeared with rust, so dusty, that they barely allowed me to discern the bars of the grille and the first reddish tiles of a roof, which the window overlooked. The tiles of that roof, the painted wood of those shutters, those panes dirty as they were, the immobile calm of inanimate things. And I thought suddenly how my father must have raised his hands, laden with rings, here to take the files from the shelves of that case. And I saw those hands, as if of wax, white, fat, with all those rings, and the red hairs on the fingers, and I saw his eyes, as if of glass, blue and sly, intent on searching in those files. Then, with dismay, to erase the ghost of those hands, there emerged before my eyes, imposing itself there, the solid volume of my body, dressed in black. I heard the hastened breathing of this body that had entered here to steal, and the sight of my own hands, opening the doors of that case, made a shiver run down my spine. I clenched my teeth. I shook myself. I thought with anger, where, among so many files, will I find the one I need? And just to be doing something immediately, I began to pull down files by the armful, throwing them on the table. At a certain point, my arms ached, and I didn't know if I should laugh or cry. Wasn't it a joke, this stealing from myself? I looked around again, because suddenly I no longer felt sure of myself in there. I was about to perform an act, but was it me? I was again assailed by the idea that into the room had come all the outsiders inseparable from me, and that I was about to commit that theft with hands not mine. I looked at them. Yes, these were the ones I knew as mine, but did they belong only to me? I immediately hid them behind my back, and then, as if this weren't enough, I closed my eyes. In that darkness I felt in me a will that ranged beyond any precise consistency, and I had such a horror of it that I was about to fail. Also with my body, instinctively I stretched out a hand to support myself on the table. I opened my eyes wide. "Why, yes, yes," I said, with no logic, like this. And I started searching among those papers. How long did I search, I don't know. I know that my anger itself flagged at a certain point, and a more desperate weariness overcame me as I sat on the chair at that table, now all cluttered with piled-up papers, and I had another pile of papers on my lap, crushing me. I lay my head down and I yearned. I really yearned to die in this desperation that had entered me, afraid of no longer being able to carry out my unheard-of plan to the end. And I remember that, with my head lying on the papers, my eyes closed perhaps to repress tears, I heard there, as if from an infinite distance, in the wind which must have sprung up outside, the mournful clucking of a hen who had laid her egg, and that clucking took me back to a country house of mine, where I hadn't been since my childhood. But then nearby, I was irritated by the intermittent creaking of the shutter, slammed by the wind, until 2 knocks at the door, unexpected, made me jump. I shouted furiously, "Don't bother me," and immediately I returned to my persistent search. When I found the file at last with all the papers concerning that house, I felt liberated. I sprang to my feet, exultant, but immediately afterwards I turned to look at the door. This change was so rapid from exultation to suspicion that I saw myself and I shuddered. When I found the file at last with all the papers concerning that house, I felt liberated. I sprang to my feet, exultant, but immediately afterwards I turned to look at the door. This change was so rapid from exultation to suspicion that I saw myself and I shuddered. Thief! I was stealing. I was stealing, really. I was going to set my back against the door. I was unbuttoning my vest. I unbuttoned the front of my shirt and stuck that fairly bulky file inside. A cockroach, unsteady on its legs, emerged at that point from under the case, heading for the window. I was promptly over him with my foot and I crushed him. My face twisted in disgust. I crammed all the other files back into the case at random and I left the room. Luckily, Quantorso Furbo and all the clerks had already gone. There was only the old caretaker, who could suspect nothing. All the same, I felt the need to say something to him. "Mop the floor in there," I stepped on a roach, and I ran to Via del Crocifisso, to the office of Stampa, the notary. Chapter 7. The Explosion. I can still hear the sound of the water pouring down from a drain pipe near the still unlit street lamp in front of Marco de Dio's hovel, in the alley already dark before sunset, and I see there, standing along the walls for shelter from the rain, the people witnessing the eviction, and other people who, under their umbrellas, stop out of curiosity, noticing the tumult and the heap of wretched belongings forcibly cleared out and exposed to the rain there in front of the door, amid the screams of Signora Diamante, who, from time to time, also comes to the window, dishevelled, to hurl certain strange imprecations, greeted with whistles and other rude noises, from the barefoot ragamuffins who, heedless of the rain, dance around that heap of poverty, splashing water from the puddles on the more curious who then curse. And the comments, more disgusting than his father. "In the rain, if you please, he wouldn't even wait till tomorrow. To take it out like this on a poor madman, usurer, usurer." And they make me smile. I'm a bit pale, yes, perhaps, but I feel also a voluptuous pleasure that keeps my viscera tense and tickles my throat and makes me swallow. Only from time to time I feel the need to grasp something with my eyes, and with a show of unthinking indolence, I look at the architrave of the door of the hovel to isolate myself a moment with that sight, confident that no one, at a moment like this, would think to raise his eyes for the mere pleasure of confirming that this is a dreary architrave, different to the noises of the street. Grey, peeling stucco, pocked here and there, it doesn't feel, as I do, the need to blush as if in offended modesty because of an old chamber pot, cleared out of the hovel with the other objects, and exposed there to everyone's sight, on a little cupboard in the middle of the street. But I came close to paying a high price for this pleasure of self-detachment. When the eviction was finished, Marco de Dio, emerging from the hovel with his wife Diamante, and glimpsing me in the alley between the bailiff and 2 guards, couldn't contain himself, and as I was staring at that architrave, he hurled his old stone-cutter's mallet at me. It would surely have killed me if the bailiff hadn't been quick to pull me aside. In all the shouts and confusion, the 2 guards dashed to arrest that poor wretch, infuriated by the sight of me, but the growing crowd protected him and was about to revolt against me, when a dark little man, shabby but fierce of aspect, the articulated clerk in the notary stamper's office, climbed on a table there in the heap of objects cleared out in the middle of the street, almost leaping and with furious gesticulations, and began to yell, "Stop! Stop! Listen to me. I'm here in the name of the notary stamper. Listen to me, Marco di Dio. Where is Marco di Dio? I've come in the name of the notary stampo to tell him there's a donation for him. That usurer Moscada. I can't describe it. All a shudder, waiting for the miracle, my transfiguration from one moment to the next, in the eyes of all. But suddenly that excitement of mine seemed to shatter into 1,000 bits, and my whole being was hurled and scattered, here and there, by an explosion of shrill whistles, mixed with unruly howls and insults from all that crowd at my name, unable to understand that it was I who had made the donation. After the fierce cruelty of the enforced eviction, death to, down with, the crowd yelled, usurer, usurer. Instinctively, I had raised my arms to signal them to wait, but I saw myself in an imploring attitude, and I lowered them at once, with that clerk on the table, waving his arms to impose silence, went on shouting, No, listen, he did it. He made the donation, in the notary stamper's office, the donation of a house to Marco di Dio. The whole crowd, then, was stunned, but I was as if distant, disillusioned, dejected. That silence of the crowd, nevertheless, attracted me, as when you set fire to a pile of wood, and for a moment you see and hear nothing, and then a corn cob here, a bit of brush there, catches, sparks, and finally the whole pile is crackling with tongues of flame in the smoke. Him! A house? How? What house? Silence! What's he saying? These and other similar questions began to burst from the crowd, spreading quickly a more dense and confused babble of voices, as the clerk confirmed, Yes, a house, his house, at Via dei Santi 15, and that's not all, also the donation of 10,000 lire to set up and fit out a laboratory. I couldn't see what followed. I deprived myself of that pleasure because at that moment I was anxious to run somewhere else, but I learned a little later what pleasure I would have had if I had remained. I had hidden in the vestibule of that house in Via dei Santi, waiting for Marco di Dio to come and take possession of it. In that vestibule there was only the barely perceptible light of the stairs, when, still followed by the entire crowd, he opened the street door with a key sent him by the notary and glimpsed me there, huddled against the wall like a ghost. For a moment he changed expression, recoiled, stepped back. His horrible eyes gave me a look that I will never forget. Then, with an animal snarl, which seemed compounded of sobs and laughter, he leaped on me, frenzied, started shouting at me, whether to praise me or to kill me, I don't know, slamming me against the wall. Madman! 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 It was the same cry of the whole crowd there, outside the door. Madman! 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 All because I had wanted to prove that, for the others too, I could be someone different from the man I was believed to be.